edition of the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. Today is the 8th day of August in the year 2016, and we are into the month of August, obviously one full week plus a day. And it is a pleasure to be with you on this, the first day of a new week. As we move towards the election, we're down to about 90 days before the election. I went to some training on how to be a successful candidate on Saturday, and spent the bulk of the day in session on Saturday, and learned a lot. It was very, very informative for me, I guess. When it comes to mounting a campaign, I guess I'm much closer to Donald Trump than I thought I was before the training on Saturday. Most of what I had projected on doing was pretty much from the gut, which is the way Donald seems to be conducting his campaign. We'll get into a little bit about that in a moment. And the reality is that there's really a lot more to putting a campaign together than I really ever appreciated until Saturday. It's not that this is totally new information to me. It's just that when you kind of get it all at once in one hit, you begin to realize that you have barely scratched the surface on something that's quite complicated and has a lot of moving parts to it. And so, but it made me realize that we're about 90 days from the election. And it is on November 8th, and today is August 8th, and I guess it's exactly 90 days now that I think about it, although math is not one of my stronger suits. There seems to be a pretty good symmetry there. Anyway, it is a pleasure. I hope your weekend was well, and that you're ready for another week, and that your week will be a pleasant one. I look forward to this week here at the Virtual Center. I think there are a number of issues as we move closer to the election. There seems to be a general sense amongst the media that political news is probably going to slow down for a while because of the Olympics. The fact of the matter is, the Olympics are making some pretty astounding political news of their own. When you talk about the doping scandal on the Russian team and a number of other issues. Get into it. I used to get into it probably a little bit more than I do now, although I do have to admit that I watched two or three events over the weekend, swimming events, and really got excited. But there's just the competition. There's something about the competition that fires you up. And even though you might think you're not interested, when you actually begin to watch it, it is kind of exciting. And to watch Michael Phelps win his 19th gold, and to watch the young lady beat her own world record by 2 seconds, which is pretty incredible in swimming, I guess. And anyway, it's kind of exciting. I do look forward to this week. I would love to hear from you. We have our phone number available if you'd like to get on the air. I have chatted before we went on the air today with Bob and Agnes both. So they are both in the studio, I'm guessing. So if you use our phone number and you do call and want to get on the air, either Bob or Agnes will most likely answer the phone, and after a brief hello, you'll be on the air, and we would love to hear from you and hear your thoughts on some of the issues and some of the things that we've been talking about, some of the things that are making news for all of us. The phone number is area code 304-663-4676. 304-663-4676. If you're a little bit uncomfortable about getting on the air, but at the same time you would like to express yourself, your ideas or whatever, you can do it in an email directly to me. My email address is waobrien906@gmail.com. waobrien, OBRIEN 906@gmail.com. And I do alert you, as we always do, to the existence of our Facebook page. For those of you who are regular users of Facebook, and I know many of you are, if you go to Facebook and you focus on the search box at the top of the homepage and just type in the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution, you will be on to our Facebook page. And on that page, there are a number of issues that I've posted in previous days and weeks, and over the last several days, I've been pretty active. I think there were 4 or 5 postings that I've put on there over the last 4 or 5 days. Most of them tied to links to particular stories that I felt were really worth a read. And the people that follow our page, the Virtual Center page, on a regular basis, these are pieces or links to articles that I thought the folks who listen regularly to the Virtual Center really ought to take a look at. And usually, if I put a link, as I've mentioned this before, so I won't take a lot of time on it, but I usually try to put a couple of comments on these links rather than just recommend them cold. And I make reference to the fact that there's been some research which indicates that many people who are regular users of Facebook tend to share the links without reading the stories that they are forwarding, that they are sharing. And I'm a little bit disturbed by that. And so I usually read the story before I make the determination that I think there's something in here, or there are things in here that people whose intelligence and sense of commitment I respect would find interesting or worthwhile. And what I try to do in my comments is alert you as the potential reader to what I think is in there that might be worth your time. And then you can make the judgment as to whether in fact you have the appropriate time. And I would love to hear back from you on some of these suggestions. If you don't think that the piece was worth reading, and you're willing to let me know why, then by all means, I'd like to know for future reference. And if indeed you did find the piece worth reading, I'd be interested in your thoughts about why you did, and whether in fact you feel it's something that people you know might find interesting or worthwhile as well. So again, there are a number of issues on there. Some of them are pertinent to the local political situation here in West Virginia, which of course is where I'm broadcasting from, and tied up directly with West Virginia politics. And the fact that I am a candidate in this particular round of elections means that I'm following the local issues here in West Virginia pretty closely. And so I am aware that there are occasions where I might post something on the Facebook page that seems to me pertinent, but at the same time, I may be making some assumptions here because I know many of you are not in West Virginia. And so, I try to be a little bit aware of that, but at the same time, these are things that interest me, and I sometimes put them on the page and post them, and then I say, gee, I don't know if anybody, most people really be interested in that or not. But once it's on there, it's on there. So, and if you don't believe that it ought to be there, then I would appreciate you letting me know. I mentioned just a point of reference a couple of moments ago. Let me kind of take a moment and talk about today's program a little bit, at least as I envision it. This is one of those, I think some of the journalists refers to it as a potpourri, kind of a little bit of this and a little bit of that day, so to speak, rather than anything substantive that we would devote the entire 2 hours to. We often do that. But there are several items or several issues over the last 4 or 5 days that I've put together. I've printed copies of them off for myself. I've made my notes to myself on them. These are things that I thought we might spend a moment or two or a little bit of time on here at the Virtual Center. And it just so happens that there are a number of them. And some of them are probably a little bit more important than others. But I thought that the first thing that I would do in our first hour is go back to a topic that we were on before. But on the other hand, since it's been 5 days since we have been together, I thought I would go back and touch on this particular issue again. And that issue is higher education. And let me kind of explain why I thought that maybe one more quick visit to that particular topic might be worth some of our time in our first hour today. And then there are other issues I'd like to get to. I'd especially like to get to, and I think everybody is dealing with this, is the nature of the campaign for president, the national election, and more specifically the Trump campaign. And some of the things that seem to be happening, everybody, journalists, regular columnists on most of the major papers, it seems like they're all writing about Donald Trump. He's dominating the news. And of course, we know, having been through the primaries with Donald, that is not an accident, that his whole strategy is pretty much devoted to dominating or controlling the news cycle, so to speak. And he's doing it. And there are 3 or 4 pieces that I've kind of put together here in a group. And I don't want to necessarily emphasize or overemphasize any one of them so much as talk about the 4 of them or the 5 of them, however many there are, and just talk about what it tells us about the nature of this campaign. I mean, it is, when you think about it, it is fantastic. I think, and what I mean by fantastic is extremely interesting. It seems to be breaking new ground all over the place. How many times do you hear people say there's never been a campaign like this, or a candidate has done this or that, or has tried to do this or tried to do that? The campaign of a major party coming out of the convention and running against the leadership of his own party, which is really what's happened over the last week. And the result of that, of course, is that rather than focus the campaign on his opponent for the most part of the last week, Donald Trump has really focused his campaign on those that he's having little disagreements with within the Republican Party itself, within his own troops, so to speak. And many, many people within the party are getting very, very disenchanted and very frightened, very concerned by the fact that he doesn't seem to be, the term they use, they just don't seem to be able to get him on message. And, every time it appears that they've succeeded in doing that, he goes off message. And so to use the term loose cannon in politics might not be the most appropriate term, but on the other hand, it makes pretty good sense here. So I'd like to spend a little bit of time talking about that. Also, there's an issue here in West Virginia. One of the statewide campaigns here, the one for Attorney General, is getting an awful lot of attention. In fact, it's very interesting because the gubernatorial race here in West Virginia, at least up to this point, with 90 days to go, hasn't really been getting the kind of media attention that some of the other races have been getting. The Attorney General's race has really been getting a lot of attention here, and part of the reason is because of the incumbent. The Republican incumbent in the Attorney General's office here in West Virginia is a pretty provocative guy. He's new to West Virginia. He came here specifically to run for Attorney General, and he was successful in securing that office in 2012, I believe. And I believe it was 2012 he won that office. And West Virginia, over the last couple of years, besides its economic problems, has also been buried under an incredible opiate problem. Overdosing, overuse of prescription drugs. And so basically that's received the bulk of the attention of the Attorney General's office, at least in the last year or two. Well, the fact of the matter is the Attorney General, before he came to West Virginia and ran successfully for the Attorney General's post, was a lobbyist for many pharmaceutical companies. So the irony of the situation is when he came to West Virginia and successfully won the election and took over the Attorney General's office, he was involved in some suits, state suits, against some of the very clients that he had been working for before he came here. So in the minds of many people, it's raising serious issues of conflict of interest, at least the perception of conflict of interest. And there was a fairly lengthy article in our local Gazette, Charleston Gazette, this weekend that addressed that particular issue. And I wanted to share some of it with you because again, I don't want to get involved necessarily in the details of that particular election. I mean, I have my own feelings about it, and in terms of who I want to win. That's not really the point. The point is what we can learn from the controversy itself. It seems to me that there are lessons within that campaign that I think can help to inform all of us. And that's really what I'd like to focus on. That's really, it seems to me, where the greatest worth of addressing that particular issue lies. And then there's a couple of more issues that I thought you might find very interesting. These are minor issues. If we don't deal with them today, perhaps we can deal with them tomorrow. I don't know how long they'll take, but I think with our phone number here, it's always possible that one of our listeners will tie into one of these issues and take an issue that we expect to pass over briefly and turn it into something that we dwell on for a specific, pretty healthy length of time. And that's fine. One of the issues that I would talk about is an issue related directly to the arts. More specifically to the concept, the idea of beauty. And I was very, very fortunate this weekend to wander into a piece, and I honestly can't remember how I ended up doing this. It could have been something that I saw on Facebook. It likely was. I have some good friends, many of them I taught with, who are in the arts, and I regularly hear from these folks on Facebook, and I'm kind of thinking that's probably where it came from. I did so much reading this weekend, I can't remember specifically where this particular piece came from, but I read it. It was a link to a particular article. I found the link intriguing. It did seem to me to be something worth pursuing, with the possibility of taking some time here at the Virtual Center to address it. And I did some background reading on the author, and I found it pretty informative. And I thought, well, this might be worth 10 or 15 minutes of our time here at the Virtual Center. People might find this worthwhile. On the other hand, if they don't, then if we just spend a brief amount of time on it, it won't be we won't be diverting their attention from issues that they care more about by too much. But that issue, I think, is particularly important, and I'd like to take a moment to address it. The other issue is a health-related issue, and it deals with the epidemic, and I guess that's the appropriate word, the health epidemic in the country of high blood pressure, hypertension, and the millions of people that suffer from. I'm one who suffer from it. And there's been some work. There was a piece this weekend by people in the medical field, and there's been quite a bit of research on the issue of hypertension. And basically, the conclusion that these folks reached was that there's quite a bit of evidence that the epidemic of hypertension in our society is probably directly related to stress. And the research has pretty much pointed to who seems to suffer most from this particular problem, and to speculate a little bit on why that might be. I found it particularly interesting. Again, especially since I'm one of the people that is involved in this. Because there's absolutely no question. There is some validity to this question, this issue of stress. I think we all have, in this day and age, I think all of us experience stress from one direction or another. I think the key is not so much whether we deal with it or not, but how we deal with it. And so perhaps in the course of addressing this particular issue, there might be an answer or two that might surface, that might give us some hints as to the best way to address these kinds of things. But anyway, the point, I guess the point of the story is there's quite a bit going on. And all of it, it doesn't even get into the issues of foreign policy and the issues of global considerations and all the rest of it, which are there as well. So there's a lot to cover. There's an awful lot going on. And I'd like to do, if I could, I'd like to begin where we left off several days ago, which is dealing specifically with the issue of higher education. And let me be very specific as to why I felt that one last visit to this topic, at least this time around, might be worthwhile. One of the things that it seemed to me has intrigued me, obviously, is the fact that we have devoted so much of our attention over the last 4 or 5 programs to the issues of education generally, and the last couple of programs more specifically to higher education. And more specifically, we've been linking the issues related to education, and again, more specifically to higher education, to the issues related to economic development. And what we've begun to see is that some of the age-old controversies, which have pretty much grounded or dictated the debates in this nation over higher education for many, many years, have begun to come together in this particular question, this particular issue of economic development, of growth, of job creation. And I think I've been fairly honest here over the last several programs. I don't know that I particularly asserted myself this way, but I'm prepared to do that now in case there's any question. One of the, and I've mentioned before that there's no question that much of the debate around the issues of higher education have really focused on the controversy over education itself. Is the purpose of a college education to educate the individual and enable the individual to reach the maximum potential that lies within her or him? Or is the purpose of education the ability to get a job? The ability to land in a career that pretty much guarantees a quality standard of living for the individual and those people closest to that individual, namely the family, the children, grandchildren, etc. And one of the things, first of all, the point that I wanted to make, which it seems to me is a little bit of honesty, although I haven't intended to not be honest, but I don't think I've asserted myself as much as I should. In that particular debate, I have traditionally taken the position of supporting education is something much more significant for the individuals involved than merely getting a job. I've been one of those people that believes that a good education, that a person who comes out of college with a good quality education will find the job or the career that will work for that particular person. And so I've tended to put my attention, my focus on the quality of the education itself, rather than simply the issue of getting a job. I've run into a lot of friends, a lot of colleagues who don't agree with me. And their position now is, with the economy in a particular state that it's in, with the pressure and the competition for skills, and for a shrinking number of jobs becoming more keen, becoming more difficult and more stressful, very honestly, then I have had people say straight up, in this day and age, if you don't look and approach your education from the perspective of what it's going to do for you in terms of getting you a job, a good job, then you're doing a disservice to yourself and all of those people who depend on you. Very honestly, then, many of these people, and many of them are business people, many of them have gone through college and majored in business, whether it's business law, whether it's corporate law, or whether it's management, or whether it's accounting, or whether it's sales, whatever particular specialization within the business world it might be, finance. The fact of the matter is, many people, many of those people did believe and continue to believe that the real issue is getting the kind of job which will provide a quality lifestyle for you and for your family. And they believe that if you can successfully find that, then the other things associated with quality of life will take care of themselves. I felt the same way about the other side of the coin. I felt that if you have the kind of quality education that really equips you to be creative, to be inventive, to be, I was going to say aggressive, and that's not the right word, but to be a leader, it just seems to me that if your education has done those things for you, then finding a successful career is going to come naturally, so to speak. It's just going to fall into place. So the irony is, I think people on either side of that particular argument believe the same thing to be true, whichever side of the particular coin, whichever side of the coin they are on. It is my belief, and I think I've said this in the past, it is my belief that much of the debate over education to get a job versus education for quality of life, if you will, and I know one is related to the other, obviously, then I think much of the context for that debate has been the nature of the society we've lived in over the last century and a half. I think most of us have gone through, are products of a society in which industry, manufacturing, was probably the key. And many people who have been able to find their way into what we call the middle class has been able to do it because they've been able to land well-paying jobs in manufacturing. And the fact that that life is pretty well on the downturn, and that the jobs in manufacturing have tended to disappear as a result of globalism, as a result of the international economy, as a result of competition around the world, and all the other things we've talked about. But the fact of the matter is, as long as the nation's major mode of employment was in one aspect or the other of manufacturing, industry of one kind or another, then it seemed to me you had the possibility of going in either of two directions. You could either focus on getting a job in industry. Here in West Virginia, for example, for 100 years, that direction has been coal. And the fact of the matter is, you didn't need a college degree to get a job in the mines. Many people went that way because these were good-paying jobs. Obviously, they came with a lot of danger and a lot of pressure and a lot of stress and a lot of illness and all the rest of it. But the fact of the matter is, for many people who grew up in this area, the dangers were worth it because the salaries were good. And people who had lifetime employment in the mines did well in this area. They earned good salaries. They lived in nice homes. They drove nice cars. They could vacation on a regular basis at the beach or whatever. And so for the longest time, not getting a college degree, but going directly from high school into the mines was a worthwhile choice for many people. Those jobs are gone. And what's left are the careers that took you in an opposite direction, which was the need for higher education, the need for education beyond high school. Whether it's a couple of years in a community college or whether it's a 4-year degree, or if you're going into a profession, it's professional school after you get your undergraduate college degree, your bachelor's degree. And more it's becoming clear that what jobs are available to that group. And the jobs that were available to the other group have been disappearing. And what they've been replaced by are service sector jobs, which pay less, which are less dependable, less stable. Many of them do not carry benefits. Many of them are part-time rather than full-time. And so the fact of the matter is, an awful lot of people have been hurting because they've been unable to slide easily into the kinds of changes associated with a changing economy. How does that relate to the whole topic of higher education? It seems to me that what we're confronting in the modern period, in the so-called information age, the post-industrial age, the age of what Richard Sennett referred to as the new capitalism, is a world in which the previous choices that were available to people are no longer there. And the fact of the matter is, all of the opportunity seems available only if you go in one direction, which is higher education of some sort, post-secondary education. And the fact of the matter is, in many cases, the K through 12 education that used to get people through high school and into the mines or into manufacturing of some sort, people in the Rust Belt, in the industrial Midwest and Northeast, for example, that got jobs in steel or in manufacturing of various kinds, or in textiles. Those were good jobs. If you've driven through New England, look at some of those mills that have been shut down. Those were good jobs. They were major employers. And people who worked those jobs lived well. And they don't exist anymore. So the fact of the matter is, the old distinction between education and training doesn't apply anymore. Because the fact of the matter is, we've reached the point where quality higher education is job training. No longer is it an either or. It's a synthesis of the two. And in the world of the 21st century, the employment world of the 21st century, job training, career education is high quality education. So the fact of the matter is, the two different approaches to education, which used to explain people's choices, people's world or life choices, if you will, have merged into one. There's only one way to go. And the nation is reeling under the stress of trying to meet that kind of change. I don't think our K through 12 schools have successfully made it yet. The debate that we've had over the last couple of years over the Common Core, for example, seems to be a debate. And again, there's all sorts of political issues associated with that. We've touched on those before. At this point, I'm not talking about that. But in matter-of-factly, the debate over the Common Core seemed to be a product of a world made up of choices that are no longer there. I didn't believe, and now I believe even less. I don't believe that those people who had issues with the Common Core, who were opposed to it, and who believed that that kind of education was not appropriate for everybody, but just for the few, I believe they are wrong. I believe they are naive. I think what the Common Core offered was the roadmap to the world of the 21st century. But a lot of people were not prepared to take that road. At least not yet. They will be. They'll have to be. But at this point, they still believe that the choices that used to be there are still there. They're not. At least I don't believe they are. And so my feeling is the kind of education that used to be defined or limited to the few, to the upper classes that were going to college, there was no question. These were college prep students. The kind of education that they got in this new world has become the kind of education that everybody has to be able to get to one degree or another. And what that means is we have to dissect it. We have to figure out what there is about it that makes it a necessity for everybody, not just for a few of us. And I think that's where we've been. I really believe that over the last couple of programs here at the Virtual Center, we've begun to touch on exactly what the key issues are that need to define the future direction of education in this nation at all levels. I think the distinctions between secondary school and college are less meaningful than they ever were before. I think the debate between an education to get a job versus an education for a lifetime of self-learning that used to distinguish the two kinds of education no longer works. I think that what we've got to do is figure out what it is that the education for the few contained that everybody now needs. Pull it out, extract it, dissect it, understand it, and then reconfigure it in a way where everybody can benefit from it. I think this is the education for the 21st century at all levels. I think reform in secondary education and K through 12 education, and again, I'm not so much talking about elementary education here. The key challenges in elementary, in the first, in preschool and the first 3 or 4 years of school, are all prior to the decisions that have to be made, that used to be made later. I think all of us in elementary school were the beneficiaries of pretty good education, pretty good teachers. Because I think learning in the first few years for children, for young children, we've pretty well got a handle on. We've had a handle on it. There's no question that some of the best teachers are our elementary teachers. And the fact of the matter is, one of the things that helps make them the best is they're dealing with young kids who seem to have an innate desire to learn. They're dealing with motivated children. And all they have to do is come up with strategies, ways to satisfy the child's yearning to learn. Many of our education teachers have been able to do that. I inadvertently said most, and maybe I do mean most. But in my years, one of the things I found, it's some of the best, most creative, most sensitive and perceptive teachers are our elementary teachers. They know how to turn kids on. And that's what education is all about, is getting children so excited that they are willing to engage content, what it is they're supposed to learn. They don't just memorize it as elementary kids. They absolutely embrace it. They wrap their arms around it and make it part of them. They internalize it and make it part of them. They know it. And if it satisfies their desire to learn, they come back for more. And the best teachers are the ones that can be there for that more. But we also know that the transition from elementary into middle school and then high school involves some major changes, not only amongst the children, but amongst the educational establishment as well. Something happens in the transition. So by the time we run into children who are in middle school, who are 13, 14 years old, for many of them, most of them I would say, education has ceased to be a positive experience. And for many, it's become a frightful negative experience. And it's from then on that's a struggle becomes society's struggle. For many kids, high school graduation is being released from prison. For some kids, turning 16 and being able to quit is a victory. It seems to me that what we've got to try to figure out is what is it we're doing at the secondary level that has turned learning from such a positive experience for little kids into such a negative experience for those same kids when they get older. And once we figure out what it is that we're doing, we've got to stop doing it. And we've got to figure out what is it that excited children. If learning was exciting for young kids, then damn it, learning is exciting. And somehow we need to figure out how we can keep it exciting. I have always believed, that that's possible. And for those who are destined to go to college, who grow up in homes where both parents are college educated, where going to college was never a question, it was always a given. These children knew from the time they could understand, they could reason, that for them education wasn't a 12-year experience. Education was a 16-year experience or a 20-year experience, or for some people, they even realized it was a lifetime experience. They realized that learning never ends. Somehow, we need to find out how to extract what it is in their education and find a way to make it available to all children. Because that's what the new world, the new capitalism, if you will, requires of us. And I think that's where we are. And so I believe that these issues associated with education are critically important. I've tried in the piece that I put together, which I'm hoping will be published in the near future, really lays out the origins of this particular issue. I'm going back to a question that I didn't answer. And that is, what is there about this subject that caused me to believe that one last time through it was significant at this time? And the answer to that question is, I realized this weekend that I've been talking about engaging material, engaging content over and over again. I've used words like engage and embrace, but I never really explained or tried to explain what that is. How do you do that? And I kept thinking to myself this weekend, it doesn't do any good to tell people that we need to reform education so that young people need to be able to engage material. And I began to think, for most people, they have no, what the hell does that mean? Engage it. I use that word over and over again on the assumption that people know what it is. But the fact of the matter is, most of us can't know what it is. The reality is, much of what we've done here at the Virtual Center in the times that we've been together has been examples of engaging content, of engaging material. But while we were doing it, we didn't define it that way. And that's really, it seems to me, the missing piece. Because there's absolutely no question that what we have done and what we must do is we must bridge the gap, the distinction between the idea that content is education and the reality that education is what happens within the child, within the student, once that content is engaged. So you can't measure the success of education by measuring the specifics of the content, because you haven't been able to touch the degree of understanding of that content. Mortimer Adler, the deceased philosopher, author of a book that I've mentioned many times called How to Read a Book, which I think is one of the most spectacular pieces of writing I've ever read. Mortimer Adler distinguished reading for information and reading for understanding. It's one thing to learn to read so that you recognize things, so that you can memorize stuff, so that when you see it, you'll recognize it. You can pick it out of a crowd, so to speak. But most of us know that that's the level of education we've gone through. Most of our tests have been information-based tests. And we've been evaluated based on how much of the information we can recognize. Almost never does our testing get into how much of it do we understand. It's kind of like the difference between reading words and understanding the words you read, reading comprehension. There's a major difference. One of the things that Mortimer Adler pointed out, and he first wrote the book in the 40s and then revised it in the 60s, Adler points out that most of our official institutional education process, our K through 12 schools, never get beyond the reading for information stage. And the fact of the matter is, as long as these people were going to leave school when the law said they could and go into industry or manufacturing of one kind, go into the world of work, the kind of work for which they didn't need a college education, then reading for information was fine. Because what it permitted you to do was identify the really bright kids who seemed to be able to master huge amounts, handle huge amounts of content. By identifying them, you could single them out and subsidize their education and with grants and scholarships and all the rest of it, and move them on and say, you need to try college, you need to try this or that. But for most of them, that never happened. And it didn't need to happen. Because the job that they had in mind or where they were going didn't require any more than that anyway. It was only education for a few people that got into the issues of reading for understanding. And the key factor in the difference between those two is the issue of engaging content. Because when a student engages content, that means that the student is reacting to the content not only intellectually, not only cognitively with his brain, but his emotional being becomes involved in it also. It begins to affect what that person thinks and believes in their gut. It touches on issues of right and wrong. It touches on issues of morality. It touches on issues of ethics. It touches on the issues of making decisions. It touches on the factors that go into those decisions. And the brightest, most creative people will be those who can recognize that the issues or the factors associated with making choices are much deeper and much broader than merely picking this or that. Because the choices you make go beyond you and your preferences. They affect the people around you. They affect your community. They affect the government around you. They affect the economy in which you live and work. In other words, many of the choices that people make have impacts in so many different areas. Social areas, political areas, economic areas, cultural areas, areas related to the arts. And when you begin to appreciate all of those factors that go into choices, you have engaged the material. You have gone into it so deeply that you understand the implications and the ramifications of where it came from and where it's liable to lead you and the rest of the people around you. And of course, we know that some people, once they begin to appreciate all of those factors associated with making choices, some people find that that means they can't make choices. It becomes so complicated that they can't decide. Have you ever seen people with a menu at a restaurant? Or go in a library and decide they want to get a good book for the weekend, and they don't even know where to begin. They don't even know, there are so many factors involved, so many choices available that they can't make one. And so problem solving and decision making becomes the kind of important skills that our contemporary world, driven by the information revolution, require. We want people that can think broadly and think deeply, understand the ramifications of the decisions that they're being asked to make, and then make the best ones by weighing all the right things. That's a level of education that most of us have never experienced. It's a level of education that many of our teachers have never experienced. They can't teach it, for God's sake. They never even experienced it. They never had it in college, many of them. That's what we're talking about. When we talk about engaging material, that's what we're talking about. We come back. We're going to pause and take a break. It's just a little bit beyond the top of the hour. But when we come back, I'm going to do an example, or provide, hopefully, an example of what engaging particular piece of information or particular piece of content might involve. But first of all, I think we need to pause for a 3 or 4 minute break. It's just gone the top of the hour. It's 2 minutes after 2 in the East. You're listening to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. We're going to pause and take a 5-minute break, and then we'll be right back, and we'll do the completion. We'll have the completion of our second hour. I hope you'll stay with us. This is really, I think, important stuff. I hope you agree. Thank you. We'll be right back.
Now return to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. Here's your host, Dr. Bill O'Brien.
Thank you, Agnes, and welcome to the second hour of the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility on this Monday, the 8th day of August in the year 2016. If you are just joining us, welcome. It is a pleasure to have you with us. If you've been with us through the first hour and are still with us, then you're brave. And I mean that. I appreciate the fact so much that you're still with us. I made a comment on the chat line just as I was getting ready to come back for our second hour, that I asked Bob and Agnes in the studios whether they thought that this stuff was okay, and I made a reference to the fact that for me it's the closest thing to gold. And what I mean is, this is something that I've spent a key portion of my life on, and for me it's I'm beginning to actually understand it, if that makes sense. And I'm becoming excited by the fact that I'm actually at the point where I actually think that I can explain some of this stuff in a way where people can use it. I'd like to be able to sign a contract that says basically I can stay on this earth until this stuff is understood by a large numbers of people. In other words, if I could arrange a contract which said you can stay there until you completed this mission, I would love that. It would probably be guaranteed I'd be here for another 100 years. But the reality is that ain't true, and I know it, and I know that I don't have that much time left. And so therefore it's incredibly important to me that I'm able to share some of this material, which I believe is important. And if you are a regular listener to this program, if you were here in the first hour and you stayed around for the second hour, then to a degree you must, unless you just think I'm crazy and you find it fascinating and entertaining, I appreciate that. But the fact of the matter is you probably agree with me to a certain degree anyway. And that really kind of is what keeps me going and keeps me hopefully near the top of my game. And I hope I can stay there. I do invite your comments and because this stuff is really important. I do respect your opinions, and I would love to hear from it. I'd love to provide. I think it's absolutely so exciting that the Head-On folks, Bob and Agnes and the rest, have been able to make this network available and give all of us the opportunity to share our thoughts on some of these issues with other people out there that are thinking about the same kinds of things. Our phone number is area code 304-663-4676. 304-663-HORN, H-O-R-N, 4676, excuse me. My email address, if you're a little bit uncomfortable about getting on the air, but at the same time you'd like to share your thoughts, you can do it in an email directly to me. My email address is waobrien906@gmail.com. That's waobrien, O-B-R-I-E-N, 906@gmail.com. And I do invite you to visit our Facebook page. Much of this material is on there in postings that I put on there over the last couple of weeks. So if you go to the Facebook page and at the search box, at the top of the homepage, just type in the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution, and you will be into our Facebook page, and you can look at some of the postings on there, and you can basically scroll down until you get to the ones that deal with some of this material. I think you'll find it interesting. For those of you just joining us, we've been dealing with education, higher education specifically, and I hope that we've used our first hour to pretty much lay the groundwork for what I think it can hopefully become a meaningful second hour. I appreciate the fact, and I know some of you are saying, how long does he intend to stay on the issue of education? And as I mentioned, this issue of engagement is really the issue that really explains why I thought we better not leave it yet. Because this is one issue that I realized this weekend that I've pretty much taken for granted. I pretty much assumed that when I say engage, people would know what that means. And I think in a general sense they do. But the more I thought about it, I thought, well, maybe I can provide specific illustrations of that kind of engagement. And I can provide a number of examples because we've had a number of examples here at the Virtual Center. But at the time, I didn't take the opportunity to say, hey, right now, this is an example of what we mean by engaging content. But when we've been looking at primary documents, when we've been looking at the actual words in the Federalist Papers, or the actual words Jefferson wrote in the Declaration, and we spent an entire program talking about what Jefferson probably meant by happiness, pursuit of happiness, or what Jefferson meant by life and liberty, or what John Locke meant by natural rights, or what John Locke meant about the transition from the state of nature into organized society under the what we call the social contract. We talked about all of those things. And when we begin to speculate and we begin to point out how they work or how they have meaning socially, economically, politically, philosophically, religiously, when we begin to consider all of the various areas that these go into, this is an example of engagement. This is an example of the kind of analysis, what some people refer to, and I think many people that use this term really aren't quite aware what they mean by that term, But many people talk about critical thinking. We've got to change our schools in such a way that we include more critical thinking. And everybody reads that. But the issue is, what does it mean? And the fact of the matter is, critical thinking means engagement. It means analysis. It means understanding assumptions behind it. It means considering the intent of the person who wrote it, or the person who designed it, or the person who built it. And when you talk about intent, you're saying, what did the person who designed this, or invented it, or created it, or wrote it, what did they want me to get out of it when I read it or saw it, or put my arms around it for the first time? What did they hope that the impact of that particular thing that they wrote or they created had on me? And if that experience in me was what motivated them to do what they do, that's intent. Engagement is thinking through all of those different possibilities, pulling them all together, and then you really understand a particular issue or a particular point of view or the factors involved in a particular decision that you've been asked to make. That's engagement. And what we've got to do is find ways to turn our classrooms into laboratories of engagement. We've got to turn our teachers from lecturers of information to teachers, to real teachers, to coaches who coach the engagement process, who really know the kinds of questions that students need to ask of content in order to get them into these areas. When you hear, and I've said this many times, when you hear people say, it's not the answers to questions that are keys to education, it's the questions that the material raises, the questions it causes you to have. Well, you don't have any questions until you engage it. When you engage it, when you reflect upon it and emotionally embrace it, or try to absorb it into yourself, so to speak, that's when you begin to have questions and say, well, what about this? And what about that? And what if this? And do you think that? And it's that kind of process that is critical thinking. That is the analytical process. You can't teach it as a subject. You can't lecture on it. You've got to basically create the kind of learning opportunities that force young people to experience it. That's why when you hear about these people, in fact, there's an entire college in Georgia. Their entire curriculum is based on what they call problem solving. Their entire curriculum is based on the issue of addressing problems, solving problems. Because the fact of the matter is, if you can put each student into the situation of trying to figure out the answers to the questions that a particular engagement with material raises, then you have initiated the kind of critical thinking process that produces what we're talking about, which is education, which is the education at the kind of levels we go into. It's pretty obvious. The ones that are most adept at this are the ones that the Googles and the Microsofts and all of those giant firms are after. One of the skills that's becoming more and more a part of our contemporary 21st century curriculum is coding. And we know with a computer, internet-driven world, the idea of coding, it used to be, a few years ago, people used to call it programming, computer programming. And what it means is translating information from language, from English or Spanish or French or German or Italian or Russian or Chinese or whatever language you're talking about, and converting it into digital language, into computer language. It's in effect, it's teaching a foreign language. And it's getting people to be able to think in this second language. Some people naturally take to it. Some people find it particularly difficult. That's the benefit of taking a foreign language in school. But in order to be effective, you got to really get people into the language. You can't just spend your time memorizing vocabulary words. You've got to be able to get people so deeply into the language that they become comfortable speaking it or writing it. They become comfortable expressing themselves in their regular language or in this new language. And that requires a level of depth that many of our educators, many of our schools and colleges never got into, even when they were teaching a foreign language. They were just teaching the superficial stuff, the grammar, the rules, the structure of sentences, those kinds of things. That's really what we're talking about here, is turning our education, our classrooms, into engagement laboratories and redefining the role of teachers from messengers who bring information into the classroom to educators. What the internet does is make the information available out there, which is incredible. Access to the internet is access to all the knowledge known to mankind. So there's no problem with finding it once you learn how to maneuver or navigate the internet. So the fact of the matter is, bringing the information into the classroom is no problem. Students can do that themselves with a computer. But the actual engagement with that information needs to happen in the classroom. And what we've been doing is we're reversing that whole process. We've turned the classroom into the place where students are exposed to the information. And then we turn them loose in what we call homework, and we say, now you go home to your own kitchen or your own study. You sit down all by yourself, and you understand this stuff. And people can't do it. Most people can't do it. And so what usually happens is educators, teachers, finally say, heck, the kids can't understand this stuff. The best we can hope that they'll do is memorize it. So I'll give short answer tests. That way I can have big classes, a lot of kids, because I can grade a lot of papers very fast, or I can put them in a machine that'll grade them for me. And all it does is, do you know this piece? Do you recognize that piece of information? Do you recognize this fact, that fact, the other fact? That's not education. I would suggest to you that's what you do when you want your dog to use the front door instead of the back door, or the back door instead of the front door. or you want your cat to use the litter box in the basement, not the one in the attic. That's training. But the fact of the matter is, we need to flip the process. And the value of the internet is it gives students access to all the knowledge known to mankind. So what we need to do as teachers is we need to decide, and that's what curriculum committees do and state boards of education do and such. We need to decide what information we need to bring into the classrooms at particular levels. But we need to make it the responsibility of the student to bring the information in. In other words, you get this document or you look up this particular piece of information at home on your time. And when you come back to class tomorrow, we're going to have a class where everybody's going to know what this particular material is about. They'll recognize it. They may not understand it. They won't have engaged it, but they'll be able to recognize it. Which means together, working in teams and working as a group, they can all engage it and learn from each other as they engage together. And the teacher needs to be the monitor or the coach that makes that process happen. Everybody can participate in it. Everybody can learn as part of it. It's not a process of finding the 15 to 20% of people in the classroom that get it and then farming the other 80% out into the developmental classes or the dumbed down classes or whatever you want it to call them. That ain't going to work anymore. We tried that for 150 years or more. We've got to basically turn our classrooms into exciting places where people can learn. And it doesn't necessarily mean that they have to physically travel to campus or to a building. You can use technology to deliver the content where they live, in a neighborhood. Find an empty classroom at night and have 7 or 8 or 10 people who are enrolled or engaged in the same learning process come together and learn together. It's not necessary to bring them to where education is happening. We've got to figure out and use technology to deliver education to where the students need it, to where they are. And we can do that once we figure out what it is we're trying to do. This isn't all stuff that I dreamed up. It's not all the product of good bourbon or bad bourbon. Some people may say, no, not good bourbon, bad bourbon. In the material that we were looking at, I shared some information from something called the Yale Report, which is a report or a document written in 1828. 192 years ago, or 194 years ago. I can't remember, whatever the difference is between 1828 and 2016. Almost 200 years ago. These are not random people off the street that you're asking to give their opinion. These are the faculty at Yale, for God's sake. This is one of the most, even then, one of the most prestigious institutions in the nation, in the world. And this report, written by the faculty, these are the experts on education at that time, such as they were. In other words, the Yale report is the thinking or the advice or the recommendations of the best people that education had going for it in 1828. And they're telling us how to do it. They're telling us what they do for Yale students. And Yale students, in theory, are the best. Like today, we talk about Harvard and Yale and Stanford. And the amount of money for tuition that people pay in order to send their kids there. You're paying for the best. And here's the best from 200 years ago telling us how to do it. And we ignore it? Or we don't read it? Or we say, hell, it's 200 years ago. What do they know? What they know, they put in that report. And what's in that report is, this is how we do it. This is what you have to do in order to make it happen. And what they're saying is, it's not the content. We're experts in our field. We lecture. We make sure our students have the best information on the subjects that we're experts in. But we also insist that they understand it. We also drive them to engage the material. And what they're saying in the Yale report is, we know, we're not stupid, we know that in 4 years, we can't teach people everything. But what we can teach them is how to learn. We can teach them how to teach themselves. And that's what we do. And this report, the Yale faculty says, and this report explains to you how we do it and what you have to do in order to make that happen. And when I look at this, I mean, I'm a researcher, I'm a historian, and I'm looking at this report, and I'm in education, and I look at it and I said, oh my God, this is kind of the formula, Newton's formula for the way the universe works. This report tells us how we need to teach our young people if we really want them to learn. This is political. The fact of the matter is, by not doing it, we have guaranteed that our kids don't learn. And as the competition for jobs and skills becomes more and more competitive, more and more acute, our kids are falling behind. Because our schools can't do it, our teachers can't do it. Because they don't know what it is they're supposed to be doing. How can we hold our teachers responsible for not teaching when they themselves, as students, never experienced this? In reality, what we're doing is expecting C+ and B- teachers who were C+ and B- in college to turn out A and A+ students. It's not fair to even ask them to do that. And many of the best ones are leaving the field because they're getting disgusted by the number of people who are accusing them of not teaching well. When the fact of the matter is they're bright enough to teach well if they only knew what it was they needed to do in order to teach well. And the Yale faculty told them that almost 200 years ago. And what they said is, in 4 years, you can't teach people everything they need to know. And then by implication, they said something else. You can't even know now what they're going to know in years to come. How can you prepare them for it? How can you teach them what they're going to need to know 20 years from now when we don't know what they're going to need to know 20 years from now? How can you prepare them for jobs when they graduate 4 years from now, when in 4 years the jobs that are there now won't be there? And rather there'll be new jobs with new challenges and new skill demands. And our young people are going to come back to us and say, I put 4 years in here, I got a piece of paper saying I know it all, and I went out there and nobody will hire me. Because they're saying I don't know what I need to know. The only way to do it is the way the Yale faculty told us to do it. Teach people how to teach themselves. Teach them how to learn. So that as they come across new challenges, new learning experiences, they know how to handle them. They know how to engage. They know how to problem solve. They know how to do research. They know how to put together information and argue a point of view and make a case. What the Yale faculty is, if we teach them that, they'll handle all the details. And obviously, given the fact that this is Yale, and Yale's where Yale is today, it looks like they've done a pretty darn good job at what they do. How can we possibly continue to ignore how they do it? And basically what they're saying is an intellectual environment like Yale in other words, a classroom or a school that wants to mirror or be like Yale's is designed to produce two complementary outcomes. There are two things we do here. We provide the content. We expose kids, students, to what they need to know. They call it the furniture of the mind. They get that from us. We're the experts. We're professionals. We're the best experts there are. That's why we're at Yale. So when the young people come to us, they're going to get what it is we teach from the best person to teach it. We basically provide the furniture of the mind. We furnish the house by making sure that each student has what it needs, what he or she needs. Obviously, then it was he. What the student needs in order to have a fully functioning house. We furnish it. But then we also provide the discipline. We store the mind with knowledge, but we also expand the mind's power to understand that knowledge. And then they say, if one of those is more important than the other, it's the discipline. It's expanding the powers of the mind. What makes that happen, they say, is that we need to present the content. We need to furnish the house, the furniture of the mind, in such a way that it calls into daily and vigorous exercise the faculties of the student. In other words, we need to present the content in ways that force students to call on skills that are already within them to understand this stuff. We provide the furniture, but that's only the beginning. That sets the stage for education. It's not education, no matter what our standardized testing people tell us. What we're talking about here is a combination or a mix that produces learning how to learn. And that's a quote. We teach students how to learn. What is it we do? And here are 6 specific things that they use to explain or to define what it is to engage content. This is what they mean. 1, fixing the attention, directing the train of thought, analyzing a subject proposed for investigation. So the first thing that's necessary in order to develop or expand the powers of the mind to handle the furniture we put in it is to develop within students the ability to fix their attention, direct their train of thought, analyze the subject proposed for investigation. Second, following with accurate discrimination the course of argument. Understanding what constitutes content, what constitutes fact, and what constitutes analysis of that fact. How you put together information in such a way that you construct an argument. If we present students with an argument, they need to be able to understand how that argument is strung together, how it's put together. When you listen to Matlock or Jessica Fletcher, and Jessica begins to explain who did the murder and how she figured it out, you've got to listen to how she puts the clues together. And what she's saying is, if you ask the right questions and you put the information together in the right ways, it'll lead you to the truth, to the right answer. The third thing they recommend as part of the definition of engagement, balancing nicely the evidence presented to the judgment. Making sure that the student doesn't just present information, material, but actually balances that with their own judgment, with their own analysis, with their own argument or their own explanation as to how that content, that material fits together, how it makes sense, how it connects one thing to the other thing. The fourth piece of this, awakening, elevating, and controlling the imagination. We want young people who are creative, who are inventive, who can think, who can speculate, who can imagine, who can dream, who can say, damn it, this may sound extreme and unbelievable, but let's consider it for a minute. Let's take the information we've got and see if we can put it together in a way that makes that thing which seems totally out of the world, out of the universe, make some sense. So what we want them to do is marriage or marry, bring together, connect their dreams, their imagination with the information. Next, arranging with skill the treasures which memory gathers. Putting on the table, bringing to the fore all the relevant things we know already that are connected to this particular issue or this particular problem. In other words, using what we already know and applying it to a new situation in order to find out something we didn't know before, to create new knowledge. And finally, rousing and guiding the powers of genius. What we want to do is light the fire or light the fuse within these young people that brings out the creativity and the genius which is within them. Now, the fact is, this is Yale. And it's 1828. And the only people that can afford to go to Yale are the children of the very wealthy and the very well connected. One of the things they're assuming is that that's where genius is. That there's something about wealth that connects directly to genius. That's one of the things that we have to be aware of. What we're talking about doing is putting every kid, every student through this process and recognizing that everyone can think. All of us don't go to the same depth and the same level. There is difference. I mean, as people say all the time, some people are smarter than others. We know that. But the fact of the matter is, everybody can do this if we can teach them how to do it. We can show them how to do it. This weekend, we're approaching the end of our... I thought this material would probably take the first hour. I never dreamed it would eat up the second as well. That's okay. We'll be back tomorrow. Same time, same channel. Actually, 1.5 hours later tomorrow because it's Tuesday. But we'll pick up on this tomorrow, but we still got a little bit of time left. I mentioned that I was going to try to provide an example of engagement. This weekend, and the only reason I picked this is because it's relevant. I mean, I could have gone back to Federalist Number 10 or one of the other documents or Jefferson's Declaration or something like that as in order to provide an example of engagement, because we did that. We've been there. But this came up this weekend. My wife called me. She was in the car, and she heard a discussion on one of the stations she was listening to was being interviewed. I think it was public radio. And they were interviewing a guest. I can't remember who it was. But she called me. And she said, I'm listening to this discussion. And this guy makes mention of Madison's Federalist Number 62. And I thought to myself, ooh, 62. God, I don't even remember what that one is. And she said, well, the issue they were talking about was Obamacare, was the Affordable Care Act. And the guy they're interviewing is opposed to it, is critical of it, and thinks that it ought to be abolished. And I said, oh, I pretty well know then who it is being interviewed. I mean, the kinds of people. And she said, well, in the course of the discussion, this person mentioned Madison's Federalist Number 62. And he said, this my wife told me, and she said, he said that if you look at Madison's number 62, Madison says that passing long, complicated, cumbersome laws that nobody can understand is contrary to what our republic, what our Constitution is about. And the job of our representatives, our legislators, is to make sure that the laws they pass can be understood by the people who are expected to obey them. And they cited Madison's Federalist number 62 in order to provide background or evidence for that particular point of view. So when I was preparing today's program, I said, well, heck with it. I've been into 62 this weekend. I'll go back and I'll look carefully at Federalist number 62. And it's about the Senate. And in it, Madison goes through the way the Constitution deals with the construction of the U.S. Senate. And Madison said, we're going to examine the Senate. And in order to do that, we've got to consider the following pieces of information. First, the qualification of senators. We got to figure out what in the Constitution, what are the qualifications of senators and why did we put them there? The second consideration, the appointment of them by state legislatures. Why did we choose to do it that way? And then the third piece or the third consideration, the equality of representation in the Senate. We know in the House it's based on population. But in the Senate, every state has 2 senators, so it's equal. And then the fourth consideration is the number of senators and the length of term that they're elected for. And then finally, the powers that the Senate has. And Madison said, if we deal with each of those, we've pretty well explained why the Constitution says what it says about the Senate. And then he goes through and addresses those points one by one by one. And in Federalist number 62, he deals with the first 4. And then in number 63, he deals with the last one, which is the powers of the Senate. So if you go right to the very end of 62, toward the very end of it, Madison addresses the issues of what he calls mutable government. The dangers or the problems of passing laws that are so complicated and change so often that there's no way that citizens can even know what the law is. And basically what Madison's saying in effect is, KISS, keep it simple, stupid. And this is the way Madison explains it in his own inimitable style. So let's just focus on this particular couple of sentences. The internal effects, Madison said, of a mutable policy are still more calamitous. In other words, a series of laws that are too mutable. They change too often. Madison says the following. It poisons the blessing of liberty itself. It will be of little avail to the people that the laws are made by men of their own choice, if the laws be so voluminous that they cannot be read, or so incoherent that they cannot be understood. What Madison is saying here is, even if you elect your representatives, even if you elect the people who make the laws, If the laws are so damn complicated that nobody can understand them, then you've created a disservice. Now, of course, what Madison's not considering is the fact that sometimes those who make the laws don't want the people to understand them. That's the way our corporations, our business works. The small print in the contract. The commercial we see on television for Allstate that says you look in your insurance policy at section such and such. What does it say? Blah, 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 blah. In other words, no normal human being could understand what it says. But the attorneys that the company hires, they understand it. They know what they got to hold you accountable, but you don't even know what you agreed to. So Madison's not considering that. All right, let me stop right there. That's engagement. Taking what Madison says, his real exact words, and then speculating and saying, wait a minute, what about the fact that sometimes they pass laws that they don't want people to understand? That's analysis. That's engagement. Those are the kinds of considerations that lead you to really understand the content. That's the example of engagement that I would give there. If they be repealed, Madison said, or revised before they are promulgated, or undergo such incessant changes that no man who knows what the law is today can guess what it will be tomorrow. Law is defined to be a rule of action. But how can that be a rule which is little known and less fixed? Unquote. Madison is pointing out the importance of simplicity so that voting citizens in a republic will understand the laws that their elected representatives make. But obviously, a key consideration that Madison neglects to consider is the extent to which these people might not want the people to understand the laws that they pass, like increases in their own salary or whatever, which is why they bury these things in these huge, complicated, long pieces of legislation that have nothing to do with the original law at all. They bury them in there so that they'll pass without anybody even knowing they're there. We know how they play this game. Madison is trying to explain the Constitution and the role of citizens in a republic. What we're thinking, or what we're talking about here then, are the idea of informed citizens and educated citizenry, and what that involves, especially when the people that are supposed to be educating you are intentionally trying to give you misinformation and to intentionally confuse you. Those kinds of considerations brought to Madison's quote, brought to the words that Madison gives us, taken together and evaluated together, lead you to certain conclusions. After you've thought this through and you've reflected on it, and you see the contradictions, and you consider what Madison neglects to consider, and then you begin to think, did he not recognize that? Or did he not want to acknowledge that possibility either? Who is Madison? Whose interest is Madison most got at heart? Who's he care the most about? Maybe the fact that he doesn't mention this is because he doesn't want to mention it either. Because if he puts it in there, who would vote for the Constitution? His goal is to get people to vote for the Constitution. So he can't say anything in the Federalist Papers that's going to cause people to not vote for the Constitution. That's engagement. It is 3 p.m. We have run out of time. I want to thank you for being with us today. We'll be back tomorrow, 1/2 hour later. Thank you so much. I appreciate your patience and your tolerance. I hope that this has been beneficial. Thank you.